Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Julia Smith. I'll be the moderator today for the Feminism and Media Arts program. And we're really excited today to have Allyson Mitchell and Perrin Ireland join us. We're going to be talking about their work. Mitchell, renowned for her queer feminist installations, in Ireland for her creative feminist approaches to science studies through visual storytelling, comic essays. So these two will delve into the creative processes. Without taking too much time, I'll read their bios very briefly. So we'll start with Perrin is a media artist and video storyteller who elucidates science through art. She brings complex scientific concepts to life through research, comics, and digital storytelling. Ireland's diverse portfolio includes illustrating marine biology research at Brown University and creating impactful watercolor animations for the Natural Resources Defense Council. Her work bridges the gap between science studies and popular culture, offers new insights at the nexus of art, science, gender, and sexuality studies, and environmental advocacy. Please welcome Perrin Ireland to the stage.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you so much for having me today. My name is Perrin Ireland, and I'm going to talk to you about my relationship to political animals. This is a drawing I made. I'm dancing with lesbian lays and albatross in this image. The colony of lesbian lays and albatross in Hawaii is the largest known population of homosexual animals in the world. We'll talk about that in a moment. So I'm going to take you through one of my favorite feminist biology stories. All of the drawings that you're going to see today, I made. I compulsively draw my way through science research. I've been doing it since an undergrad degree in vertebrate embryology at Brown University, which I'll talk about in a moment. But this is a book that came out in 1992, The Pinyon Jay, by a couple of dudes that had spent a lot of time studying a social corvid, right? Corvids are crows, ravens, tool-using highly intelligent social birds known to grieve their dead. And these folks, they were finding that these birds were pacifists, and it was really confusing because the evolutionary theory with which they were most familiar posited that societies are organized around dominant male hierarchies. So there's no way for these folks to see the world outside of that if that's the approach they're taking to studying these animals. The nuance they were finding in their studies of the birds pushed them to a place where they began to come up with categories that they never quite described about how they were going to identify the alpha male they knew was in this pacifist bird colony somewhere. And so they developed this really nuanced code of conduct where if Allison's looking at me, I'm the sub. Allyson looks at me, I'm the sub. So dom and sub, of course, it's my language. They didn't have this in their 1992 book on pinyon jays. But again, other biologists looking at this study were having a hard time with this because they also name in their data that regularly the female pinyon jays were going at each other's throats with their talons. They were attacking each other with their beaks, bringing each other to the ground. Every single season, it is the most aggressive behavior observed during the year. And what was the cause of this? Could it be that they were in the dominant hierarchy? No, they had a condition called pre-breeding syndrome, akin to premenstrual syndrome. So the female animals in this complex hierarchy were either breeding or they were suffering the moods that plague one when one is not breeding, if that's what you're born to do. Our beloved feminist biologist Marcy Lawton took a look at this wonderful book, which had a lot of good research in it, and put forward that there might be a little bit of a blind spot happening. Could it be that instead of having PBS, the females were establishing hierarchy? Could we imagine that? So what these guys kept noticing is like, wow, this is so interesting. So when an alpha male, again, determined by very subtle cues that no one else was able to decipher besides the two of them, when an alpha male dies, the next alpha male happens to wind up with his widow. So it must be, they thought, that she was of very high quality and thus was selected by the dominant male over and over again. But Marcy Lawton, a feminist ornithologist, took a look at this study and was like, I'm going to propose that actually territorial fights between alpha females establish who the quote unquote alpha male, which again, very nuanced take, is establishing. Unconscious gender bias in linguistic construction, so how we say what we see, can lead otherwise scrupulous biologists. She's like, you guys do a really good job with your science. You do, but you have made embarrassing errors in this study. So I drew my way through an undergraduate degree at Brown University in biology, and I was in the lab of a scientist named Casey Dunn, and he studies siphonophores, which David Attenborough, maybe you've seen some David Attenborough documentaries. David Attenborough describes siphonophores as immortal beings because when one end of the organism is dying, the other end is budding babies, and it's all connected. So when that animal is born and dies is unknown to science. In the lab I was working at, I was studying a colonial jellyfish that has a very different concept of the individual than we have. It sort of buds out skin on the backs of hermit crab shells and then buds up individual organs that serve different functions within a colony. And my thesis advisor once said to me that human beings had the most boring life cycle that he had come across. And that statement has sparked the rest of my career. So also at Brown, I was introduced into feminist science and technology studies. So that's a group of feminists and queer theorists who are looking at knowledge production in biology, and they have some questions about how that knowledge is formed. Banu Subramaniam is a scientist who has pointed out that many of the methodologies we're familiar with in evolutionary biology come from and cannot be separated from a history in eugenics. Which is a word some of you may be familiar with, which is the pursuit of the ideal human society with a bunch of different political approaches and goals, and often a pretty racist, heterosexist execution. But it is all over the history of evolutionary biology. And unless we're talking about it, we aren't really looking at where these methodologies come from. Patricia Hill Collins puts forward a lot of work on intersectionality as praxis, and also a second wave feminist standpoint theory, which both Donna Haraway and Sandra Harding are working with. We're going to get more into that later, but it's the idea of when I'm observing something, my class, my race, and my gender experience inform what I'm able to see in the world and the questions I ask and the conclusions I draw. And this matters when we're talking about animals for human lives today. And here I am doing my morning feminist naked ritual with my cats of worshiping at the altar of my choice. I then spent 10 years at the Natural Resources Defense Council, which is an environmental nonprofit that primarily litigates on behalf of the environment and advocates for conservation policy to protect people and planet. And this is the kind of work I was doing in collaboration with scientists.
Very few people get to actually see our ocean depths for themselves. I had to gather my courage to go down to 1,500 feet in a submersible the first time I did it. But once I descended to the deep sea, it changed my relationship to this planet. You know, this is the first and only place in the Atlantic where marine mammals can swim at low risk of getting entangled in some kind of fishing gear. Obama closed it to industrial fishing. And you have these amazing deep divers of the ocean out there, like sperm whales, who can submerge for up to 2 hours at a time while they hunt for food. These canyons and seamounts lie on the edge of our continent, but they're also the beginning of the deep sea, which is the dominant ecosystem on Earth. Our planet has a long and ancient history. As you descend into the ocean, into this truly alien world, it feels like being in a time machine, seeing geological epochs go by. Being at this depth taught me that we are really interlopers into a world that isn't only ours. At first I thought being at the bottom of the sea was like being on a different planet. But then I realized, wait a minute, no, this is Earth. The truth is 70% of our planet is ocean, so we land dwellers are really the minority. And honestly, it feels wrong as visitors to demand to use every inch of this planet for our sole benefit. All we're asking is this, that we set aside these very precious and delicate areas so that they can exist on Earth along with us in perpetuity.
I did the script and I would do all of the artwork and partner with animators. And then that's an ocean scientist, Lisa Switoni. And we're working to get a marine monument protected in the Atlantic with awareness that it's a mile off the east coast of the US and most humans will not go to those depths. Of course, most of the animals you just saw pictured are living queer lifestyles and bisexual lifestyles, which we didn't go into in this effort. But this is my first moment of making really explicitly political art. And when I say political, I mean like we would push this out during a conservation campaign to get people to make public comments on environmental regulations. And public comments on environmental lawmaking really matters. And I'm going to stump speech about that later because the Supreme Court just overturned a 40-year-old environmental protection. And I'm feeling kind of devastated today, but we'll move on. So as a white feminist working at a conservation organization, I began to be interested in, for me, thinking about a multi-species alliance for protecting planet Earth forces questions about who are we in alliance with and who are we collaborating with? And some painful history in the environmental movement of overlooking longstanding indigenous efforts on behalf in solidarity with animals on behalf of planet. And also Black environmental advocacy in the US, really starting the environmental justice movement. And so I became increasingly concerned with the economics of it all. Who emits and who deals with the consequences of emission? When we force climate futures, who lives and who dies? It's really explicit and it's not an accident. And so I began translating the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports on behalf of the NRDC. Those of you may be aware of like these conferences that you hear about in the news, the IPCC convenings, international climate treaties that they're trying to form, and all the governments go, and none of the governments can agree, and all of the emitters don't want to pay reparations, and everybody goes home upset. Yeah, so I was drawing that. It's a bunch of fun. And I began to understand and be really distressed by what I just said before, which is like, they're finding in these IPCC reports, and over the course of my career in environmental advocacy, I've watched scientists go from extremely neutral language in these reports, not mentioning fossil fuels, to really desperate language where I can tell that career climate change scientists are feeling a lot, acknowledging indigenous science as science, and really wanting to talk about the social impacts, and that the difference between warming temperatures is not as important in the difference in how we treat each other. This is obviously images of Standing Rock, but these are the kind of comics I was making at the time to connect people to the environmental movement. And there was no place for me to go besides Donna Haraway from here and Marxist feminism. And maybe other people have different journeys, but that was mine. She said, there is a fine line between acknowledging the extent and seriousness of the troubles and succumbing to abstract futurism and its affects of sublime despair and its politics of sublime indifference. And this is a bit of a mantra for me because I refuse to engage in sublime indifference. I will not stop participating. Our task is to make trouble, she says, and I will continue to do that. I began working on more memoir-focused comic work. This is in Damn Joan magazine, me grappling a little bit with climate grief at the time that a bunch of these IPCC reports were coming out, and turning to the work of someone I highly recommend named Joanna Macy, who developed something called The Work That Reconnects, and has a book called Active Hope. Growing up and being with our grief allows us to have a bigger sense of time, a different sense of what it means to accomplish something. I started doing pieces connecting my personal and sex life to animals. So I lost my ghosting virginity a little bit late as a millennial. It was a later experience than many people of my generation have. And speaking of, I was talking with Allyson earlier about the politics of sublime indifference. I became obsessed with this question of like, do ghosters go extinct? Like, did he go extinct? And my focus on like, how is it that I'm having this grief about a person I met once and didn't really like that much? But we aren't actually having a collective grieving process for animals that are going extinct or people that are greatly endangered through a variety of climate impacts. Like the Caribbean monk seal went extinct when I graduated college. Why wasn't that said at our ceremony? Like just really wanting to talk about the insanity in my work more and more. Maybe this crazy feeling was about a very big collective loss that we don't know how to collectively grieve, honor, or even connect about. At the end of the pandemic summer, so summer 2020, I started a USPS project where mail art project where I sent a double-sided 8.5 by 11 black and white like science missive to people's postal boxes. It got up to about 700 subscribers before I shut it down once I started working on my book. And I used to write letters to the editor of Ranger Rick as a child, and they sent me back a bullshit postcard that was like fake child handwriting, letting me know they appreciated my letter to the editor, and they never once published one. And my blood would boil as a 7-year-old that they weren't acknowledging my concern for the environment. And so every child that wrote to my PO box had their name and their question acknowledged in the newsletter because there was a new sheriff in town, you know? So these are some of the recipients of the newsletter. This is Althea. Althea at 3 years old sent me my first copy edit note. And this is Isabel, who also was a frequent PO box submitter. So this is another project I started at the tail end of the pandemic.
Besides humans, I believe the only other known mammals to live past the age of menopause are 5 species of toothed whale: beluga, narwhal, false killer whale, short-fin pilot whale, and orca. And scientists have wondered why. Why keep a hag around, right? What's a crone for? If you look at the example of the southern resident killer whale, they live in matrilineal family units. Daughters and their offspring and adult male sons live with their mother their entire lives. Grandmothers in these communities can live to be in their hundreds, as we've seen, and they are the keepers of the knowledge about where the good salmon hunting grounds are. So much so that adult male southern resident killer whales have been observed wandering the water, starving, after they have lost elderly mothers.
The constraint of this project for me is I have 90 seconds on Instagram Reels. I've just read a journal paper that's talking about an issue that I think has like interesting social components. And the whole time that I've been doing this other work, I've been studying feminist science and technology studies at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research with Danya Glabau. How am I going to also integrate this into my little video? And this project has grown a lot, and I get to really engage with people on questions about animals that matter to them. It's called Thirsty Science. The idea was I've been, laboring away on my little watercolor videos for 10 years, and, a few 100,000 of you and some million of you have watched. But if I give you a thirst trap, would you think about animals for 90 seconds with me? And what does that do? So I began to, through a lot of questions I was getting, start to visually work with these concepts and began working on a book that's due out from W.W. Norton in early 2026, working title Poking the Squid, about the sex lives of animals. So we have suicidal sex, sexual parasitism, and long-term partnership, which, it's not so long sometimes in nature. I took the show on the road to the Format Festival in Bentonville, Arkansas, a music festival. We had a booth where I hooped, and also people filled out. I'm really interested in using my art practice as a research practice. So I'm interested in gathering people's responses to what I talk about and how they visually imagine it. So you would do a little survey. This is where you match the imagined genitalia with the animal in question. This is where you talk about anglerfish sex, and then you get a temporary tattoo as a prize. So this is a time lapse that we made of how people imagine termite queens, which basically function as massive ovaries in their termite colonies, sometimes for 30 to 40 years, laying an egg every few seconds, billions in their lifetime, and also anglerfish, which I'll talk about in a minute. So I also do there will be illustrated responses in the book, and I told people about the lifestyle of black-browed albatross. They are an albatross that's living in the Falkland Islands, and only female albatross initiate divorce. This was a study on heterosexual albatross couples, and when the ocean surface temperature is warmer, females leave these long-term partnerships. They typically stay in for 50 to 60 years, typically hovering at a 1 to 3% divorce rate. Ours is 40 for context. Emperor penguins is 80% for context. And folks said things to me like, I think they need to be given credit for the 97% success rate. My mom's been married as many times as Trump, and no one bats an eye. If human partners only spent 10 days together a year, we'd probably have a lower divorce rate too. Also, when it's hot, my husband can fuck right off. They give the term hot and bothered new meaning. Relationships are stressful and climate change is stressful. And as a child of divorce with commitment issues, I think divorce is an appropriate response when things get stressful. That's a white-bellied shag. The idea of having a faithful lover who I only see a few days a year while I gallivant around town sounds ideal. Wait, they only have sex once a year? Sounds like my old relationship. Okay. I also asked what they thought of hyena hierarchy. Hyena hierarchies are run by an alpha female, very, very tight, intense social cues and nuance. 18% of respondents would choose to be the alpha female who runs shit. I'm a top, a diplomatic top. Think Dame Judi Dench. I'm a Leo. I'd rather make the rules than inherit them. And 14% of respondents actually wanted to be the rare female who challenges the alpha female for the throne after forming alliances in the community, because fuck inherited privilege. I don't know, seems edgiest and high drama. You gotta have ambitions, girl. So this is visual research for the book in process. That's a black-browed albatross parent. This is an anglerfish. The males are barely developed past larvae. They have huge eyes and huge noses. They wander the ocean to find their mate. When he finds her, he eats his way into her stomach, fuses tissue, and doses her with sperm. Scientists believe at her will the rest of their lives. When she dies, he dies. So do they become trans? Are they in a long-term monogamous relationship? Scientists are battling it out now. This is the Deloid rotifer that has been reproducing asexually, females generating daughters for 30 million years, which blows any previous ideas that evolutionary scientists had for how long an animal could asexually reproduce, way out of the water. This is the Vagina Diversity Library at Mount Holyoke College. Patricia Brennan injects dental silicone into the vaginas of naturally deceased animals in an effort to understand what the proactive genital engagement is of female animals, right? Because a lot of the evolutionary biology stories we hear they're coy. They don't really like sex, and they pick the least awful, always male. And she's telling a really different story through comparative anatomy, which has complicated history, which we'll talk about another time. These are male seahorses. They are the ones that give birth to baby seahorses, and their body goes through the same physical changes seen all across the evolutionary tree of life in pregnant animals. They give birth to thousands of young at a time. The most important, I know I'm wrapping up, the most important long-term relationship that male dolphins have is with a gaggle of male friends that they continue to have sex with throughout their lives once they leave their mother, who teaches them a lot. That's an active learning relationship. And then they're really just having a ton of gay erotic acrobatics. This is from a book called Queer Ducks by Elliot Schrafer, which I highly recommend. And then this is a Darwin's bark spider male giving oral sex to the female. Sexual cannibalism is his inevitable fate. And this is a large-scale pastel drawing of some of my most beloved animal genitals. I'm happy to go through each of them with you later. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Perrin. That was amazing. All right, next up we have Allyson Mitchell, who is a Toronto-based maximalist artist heavily influenced by riot girl zines and bands, engaging with the uncanny world of queer feminist media and craft. Her work includes Ladies Sasquatch and the immersive Killjoy's Castle. Mitchell approaches pop culture and her own autobiography through a queer and feminist lens, working primarily in sculpture, installation, and film. An advocate for using art as a form of social critique, her installations invite viewers into conventions on gender, sexuality, and identity, challenging social norms. Please help me welcome Allyson Mitchell.
The other mic. Oh, no, okay. Hello. Is my PowerPoint coming up? Yeah, okay. So first of all, I'm very grateful to be here. You have a wonderful scene here. As an outsider observer coming in, I feel very welcome. And I can say that you have a very special connection with each other here. Having been at Ryan Rox's premiere last night and seeing the community come together around that was a beautiful experience that I really appreciate. And I feel like I have tried to bring that kind of energy to some of the work that I've been doing, and I'm going to walk you through it. So as Julia said, I'm a maximalist artist, which means I stand on a platform that is wide with theory that's queer, trans, and feminist. I also, I'm a collaborator. I have to collaborate because what I do would probably kill one person. And I'm also very much invested in maximal bodies, which I'll talk about a little bit too. So this is a painting that I made recently for something I had to do at the university that I teach at, which is York University in Toronto. But before I begin, I want to show you a short film that I made many years ago. And the reason why I want to show you is because it's controversial. It was banned in Toronto by Pride, which is a huge corporation and also a pyramid scheme. But anyway, they commissioned me to make this film that was to show in the public transportation system, and then they banned it. And so also it gives you as an audience a chance to see, what am I getting in for the next 15 minutes? Do I need to get out of here? So here we go. Dyke Pussy. As you can see, very controversial information here for you. I never was quite sure what the issue was. It was pre-Pussy Riot, so it was like maybe putting the word pussy out there was too freaky for people. It was also early texting language, so I'm like, are they not getting what I'm saying? But this confusion with institutions has fueled a lot of what I ended up making through the rest of my life. I started very early making short films using a lot of Super 8 footage. A lot of them were Super 8 film, a lot of animation, a lot of autobiographical work, and a lot of performance. And I just kind of gather this because this is also a film festival. I wanted to give you a sense of how I am part of that, telling these stories. And I'm going to show you you know what, I'm not going to show you this. If you want to see this, talk to me. It's a film called Uncatrans, and I created it with a collaborator, and we created a script that's telling the story of, through the perspective of a rural trans activist today, but found in the future in an archive. And so people are looking back at what a rural trans activist working through politics of the land, food sovereignty, and gender would say in the future. But we don't have lots of time, so I feel like I'm not going to show that. But I am going to talk about also around the same time I started making films, I got very engaged with fat politics. And I want to say this town has such a beautiful proportion of cool, sexy fat people that you should be commended. And I feel really wonderful being here. So in 1996, I discovered fat politics as a kind of queer politic. And I started a group with a bunch of other fat people called Pretty Porky and Pissed Off, where then this is a flyer from our first direct action that we did, where we were approaching people and talking openly about fat politics and body size acceptance. And we did a lot of performance and a lot of queer clubs. We performed for fundraisers. So this is us kind of doing our thing in the 90s. I moved from Pretty Porky and Pissed Off to a practice that involved a lot of materials. So when I said I was a maximalist at the beginning, I'm also a maximalist in the way that I gather a lot of materials around me to make the sculptures that I make. And so I use a lot of materials that I'm going to kind of whip through to give you a sense of just the stuffness of it. There's a lot of stuff, and also theory and books and text and things in bins that eventually become things like this. So this was an installation that I made in 2006 called Granny Square Rec Room, where my friend Paul and I brought together our collections of Afghans and encompassed an entire room. And I learned a lot through that experience about how textile absorbs sound. And my films were showing in a group exhibition, but I didn't want people to have to wear headphones. So I created this menstrual hut maxi pad micro cinema, which is like a fort that people could go into, and they wouldn't have to wear headphones, and they could watch my films. And this is what it felt like inside that space. And I also collected a lot of these hobbyist ceramic giant-headed Holly Hobby girls with the idea that they were a secret society of genius women whose brains were so big they had to wear these special hats. And this is them marching in formation towards the giant brain in the middle, creating a kind of an organism that I feel like has a conversation with some of the organisms that Perrin works with. And so there they are doing their thing. Grannies to the front. And I also created this installation called Hungry Purse, the Vagina Dentata in Late Capitalism, which is like an extension of this kind of interior space that people can hang out with and grapple with and experience their greatest fears related to mortality, appetites, women's bodies, vulvas on any kind of body, etc. And then I went on to making larger sculptures. These are two-dimensional rug pieces where I've taken from Playboy photographs and then transcribed them into giant hairy Sasquatch beasts. So Shibaka, Orangina, and then I made these gigantic three-dimensional Sasquatches. So it's meant to be a coven of lesbian Sasquatches hanging out. I use photographs of like known sightings of Sasquatches, like this one, my own body, as a way to try and understand how to create the gesture for the sculpture. And then they inhabit a space together. There's lots I can say about this exhibition, but I really want to get on to talking about newer and, for me, a little more exciting things these days. But when this show called Ladies Sasquatch traveled across 6 major museums in Canada. And at every site where they showed, even though museums had signed up for it, there was a catalog, all that stuff, people freaked out when I installed them. They were not welcoming, they were suspicious, they wanted to have language around warnings for children to experience this. Not exactly sure what the issue is with children seeing giant stuffed animals. I would be like, are you that uptight that you think animals should have clothes on? But I knew what it was, and was in my language, I was talking about how this was a coven of politicized dykes, and there was language around that. And when I realized that even in this moment, like when they were traveling, it was this moment in Canadian politics where gay marriage was becoming legal, but it was such a juxtaposition between like this supposed like welcoming into society in a way that I don't necessarily trust. And then the real lived experience of queer people on the streets, which was totally not congruent. They wanted us to be taxpayers with white picket fences, but not radical queers. So after I had this experience, I don't know why I'm choking. Hang on a sec. I'm excited. I want to talk to you so much. I must have water. After this experience with people freaking out about lesbian Sasquatches, I was like, okay, what if we apply lesbian feminist to other things that are innocuous? Like, how about lesbian feminist back to school windows? How about lesbian feminist Christmas parade, Santa Claus parades? What about a lesbian feminist haunted house? And so one of the big projects that I worked on. I actually threw in some of these slides. I wanted you to see some of the making of the Sasquatches. Is a project called Killjoy's Castle that I'm going to tell you about, that I made collaboratively with my partner, Deirdre Logue. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the collaborative work that came out of that. I might come back to this, I might not. This is a film that we made together. I know you want to see it. I know you're excited to see it, but I'm not sure if we have time. I'm going to come back to this, and I'm going to go right into talking about Killjoy's Castle, because I set it up that way. I didn't mean to, but I did. So Killjoy's Castle, Lesbian Feminist Haunted House, is a gigantic installation that we have presented in four cities for the past 10 years. And in each city, we tailor the exhibition to the community that is there. It requires we spend a lot of time in the cities to connect with queer community, and it requires that we gain a lot of feedback from people who are stakeholders in a giant queer art project happening in their town. And we also know that something called lesbian feminist will always be a site of contention, not only in that institutional way that I was talking about, but also within queer communities, because of some of the histories of lesbian feminism that have been horrifically transphobic and trans exclusionary. But that's not the kind of haunted house that we were trying to make. The method for making the haunted house is based loosely and inspired by many, many things, including large-scale artist installations, but also evangelical Christian haunted houses. So I'm going to walk you through, currently working on a comic about Killjoy's Castle. I'm going to walk you through a tour of a conglomeration of the haunted houses. So you enter through a kind of like vagina dentata, and you're greeted by queer performers who will anoint you with glitter. Someone performing as Valerie Solanas warns you about what you're about to experience. You can get out if you want to. These people, and there's also other performers outside. There's obviously it's a haunted house. There's a dark side to our history as well. This is an undead abortion activist. There's another one. You enter into the castle through the hallway of concerns that let you know what you are about to experience and what you might see, such as earnest representations of irrelevant feminist debates, giant bearded clams, lesbian gestures maximized to the thousands, strap-ons and beautiful lesbian penises, etc. You will get wet, etc. And then a demented women's studies professor tour guide takes you through and tells you what you're looking at, which will include lesbian zombie folk singers. There's another tour guide in front of the giant bearded clam. This is the gigantic non-binary godex who emits a fluid from their crotch, and they are tended to by two serfs in servitude for perpetuity at their feet, tending their fluids to make up for their horrors. This gives you a sense of the scale. This was the installation in Philadelphia, so you can see that non-binary godex inflatable up there. There's paranormal consciousness raisers. People looking at them. In Philadelphia, we nodded to 1950s activism, where office workers would come out on Fridays at their lunchtime and picket for their rights. There's a gigantic crypt of undead lesbian feminist organizations and ideas, including the gender binary. This is the giant bearded clam, in which you might get misted by water. So you have to indicate to your tour guide by clutching your pearls at the beginning that you do not want to get wet. There's the lair of the carpet muncher. These people are going up into the horrific tunnel of two adult women in love. There's the carpet muncher's lair. Carpet muncher's getting mad. Carpet muncher's voracious. These are the crumbling pillars of society that the intersectional activist is always fighting to destroy. And as a participant in the haunted house, you have to make your way through them. You can't go around them. You can't ignore them. This is the multi-faced internet troll. She is again, multi-faced internet troll, trolling you. And this is the lair of polyamorous vampiric grannies. And we're not just talking about old ladies having sex. We're talking about groups of old ladies having sex. This is the only blood in our haunted house, and it's a mishap with a diva cup. And this is the dance floor with the riot ghouls and gender studies professors with their cauldron and the radical texts. It's scary and intimidating. The Stitch Witches. And at the end, you enter into a space with real life feminist killjoys and process your experience. So unlike in the evangelical Christian hell houses where you have to choose between accepting Jesus Christ as your savior or going to hell out the door, we actually ask people to have their own opinion, talk about their experience, and process. And people, we didn't know if people would avoid this or run away, but we actually had to have somebody at the door who was like the real killjoy, had to like move people through. Okay, you got to keep going. And then there's a gift shop. And that's the outside. Scared going in, excited. If I had time, I'd show you some Killjoy's Castle videos so you got a sense of the inside, but we don't have time. I want to rather tell you about all the people who collaborate on such a large scale project. So this is the listing of the names of the people, and these are sort of the numbers: 102 performers in Toronto, 82 in Los Angeles, 95 collaborating artists in Philadelphia, and everybody gets paid. And these are the early sketches. This is the first drawing I did when I was conceiving of this project. I thought it was going to be under what do you call it? Giant highway. There's this, and these are some of our sketches and illustrations of plans, our schedules. It's a huge endeavor. Making things, installing, making the hairy holes, putting up the signs, and then one of the best pieces, which is people gathering. So queer performance artists gathering together, getting their makeup done, which is done with great precision and care. Meeting each other from vast geographies and making things together, like hundreds of crocheted cobwebs, the clam, and so on, hanging those cobwebs. And then we pack it all up. And there's a book about it if you're interested. And there's a website that's coming out any minute, like in the next couple of days. And I think I'm out of time. I would just whip through what I'm currently working on, which is a feminist art residency. I live in that little white house. There's the rainbow. If you ever want to come to Ontario and work on a project, be in touch with me. And you can come. And this is the people who organize it with me. And this is the cabin you could stay in. That's what it looks like inside. These are meadows and forest and streams and garden and some of the projects we've worked on, which I don't have time to tell you about. So you're just going to have to wonder and ask me in the Q&A if you want to know. That's it.
Great, thank you. Do you guys want chairs or?
Yeah.
I think we're good. Yeah. Thank you
Nervous
so
energy.
much. Yeah. Thank you so much, both of you. So we'll open it up for some questions. As I was listening to both of you talk, I think we're okay. Thanks, Marissa. Both of you are kind of like bringing feminist ideas into semi-mainstream spaces eco-feminism, lesbian feminism, but then we are seeing all these crossovers. I always think about psychology and like the effect or affect, that like these kinds of pieces have on people. And I was wondering if maybe both of you could speak about how you weigh the grotesque with the erotic in your art, and like how you think about that, and then how you notice different spaces responding to that like dramatic kind of dynamic that I'm seeing at play in both of your works.
Great. Yeah. I love that question a lot. And it's a line I'm constantly walking. And I like to have my thinking about that really be in conversation with people that are not inside the disciplines I'm really working with. So I'm spending a lot of time with science, and I'm spending a lot of time with feminist science and technology studies. And when I will tell a story to people, like there's this insect water striders, right? They're the ones that can stand on water. And female water striders have a kind of vaginal garage door that can open and close to prevent unwanted sex. And there's an adaptation scientists have observed that male water striders, when they want access and aren't being granted it, will alight upon the female water strider's back and shake her. Because if they're making a ripple in the water, she knows that a predator is going to be indicated, like they're going to get the memo and they're going to come. So she can either be eaten or have sex. And when I tell this story, understandably, people are distressed, like humans who have a human understanding of the world and a lot of human experiences we bring to the table, myself included, don't like that. It's upsetting. And so then what I like to do with that is go back into science and feminist science and technology studies and kind of make them answer to us, like, the story you're telling us about the world is upsetting. Can you help us understand? And so a lot of the evolutionary biologists really want to talk about, which I think deserves a lot of attention, what a different sensory experience we're having, what a different communication experience we're having. We have no understanding of their relationship to pain. And they do a lot of neutralizing, right? Like, as terrestrial animals, we have to do gas exchange. This is what Mercedes Burns, an entomologist, will say. We all have different strategies we've developed for gas exchange, being not in water and maintaining moisture. And animals all have different sexual strategies and reproductive strategies. They don't want to assign value. And the feminist biologists want to have a conversation with some of their counterparts historically who are using words like rape in science with no grounding in the painful, traumatic history of that word among humans. And so feminist science and technology studies folks are really, I think, wanting to talk about how do we bring feminist and queer theory to these conversations and allow room for our experience. And then I view my work as bringing it back into conversation with people and making room for all of it. Like, these are animals. We're telling stories about them without their consent. We haven't asked them what their experience is. We can't know their experience. We're allowed to have feelings about that experience. And in terms of this word maximalist that Allyson uses so well, like those dolphins I showed you are having sex 30 times an hour with each other in these friendships. That's not an exaggeration. So like, also the pleasure, also the eroticism, also animals' profound ability to knock our socks off and be outside our understanding with all the pleasure they're pursuing. I think it's just so humbling in terms of like, we don't know. And that being kind of the engagement with it. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah,
A
I
little.
think that's helpful.
It's a beginning.
I'm excited to hear Allison's research.
I have three things to say. One is I am a demented women's studies professor, women's studies professor. And I also, like, my brain was blown open by learning about feminist theory, but I also felt like it was so limited and not really like accessible. So part of the motivation to make sculpture was so that people could experience theory in the round, and it would be something that they could feel and touch and would give them an experiment of a different kind of access. Secondly, to be a killjoy is to point out that sex is not this like either like fake rose petal covered pathway to bed in like some sort of like weird heterosexual imagining of sexuality, or the other side of that, which would be like sexual assault, that it is gross. And also, if you come from a subject position, which is always already thought of to be disgusting, which is a fat dyke, then you got nothing to lose. So being able to play with that, having been pushed into that position for, you know, your whole adult life, then the ultimate revenge is to be playful with it and show it and do it with your friends in what ends up being like a gigantic blanket fort of Killjoy's Castle, like moving through that trajectory. So it's like creating, it's world making and creating this, like within this understanding, like owning it, loving it, and like flaunting it, the grossness. Yeah.
I love that. I think I have so many things I could keep going on to say, so I'll open it up and I'll have more if there's time. Does anyone want to throw out some comments or questions to these artists?
And so I would just like to think about, well, that in and of itself is the proof in this practice, this kind of archive that you're creating over time. And I think also, you know, there's a contemporary term known as auto theory. So, you know, it's about theorizing with and through the self. And I guess I'm interested in hearing both of you talk about your work, even though it's different things, feed into a body, possibly an archive of work. And I know you do talk about the selves in different ways in terms of identities. And then for you, Perrin, maybe less so much yourself directly, but you do find ways to insert like the ritual and stuff like that. But, you know, things like that, bringing yourself to it and how it's a body of work and how that body of work is a self thing. I've learned a lot from Allyson about archive, and I'm very excited to like that is something I think we could talk more explicitly about, just a note for us later. But like, yeah, it's true. I am in the book a lot. A decision was just made I will not be nude in the book anymore because we already think it's going to be banned. And so not having it banned for that, but instead for other content is ideal. Like we're going to figure out, there will be like shells, we'll see. But, yeah, I think like this book for me, I sort of sometimes view it as like a tawdry, trumped up illustrated book report, right? Where I'm just like, this is what the record says in evolutionary biology, and this is what queer and feminist theory says about science. And this is what like, I think it's such an exciting time. And I really want to like put a stake in the ground of making this an archive right now, because my generation of scientists is starting to have a ton of questions, right? So in terms of like what kind of archive this book is, as like, yes, it's a body of work, but the book as a place where, for me, the book became necessary because I was telling stories on the internet where people were having gut reactions that make sense. And I think they deserve more context, which is, I'm telling you this funny story about, you know, animals that have all the reproductive functions inside their bodies. And in science, those are called hermaphrodites. That's a really harmful word when it's been applied to humans historically. Why is it still being used in science? What do we mean when we say it in science? And what, like, can it teach us about like a new trans theory today, actually? Like, I want it to be that people can enter a biology education and not be told that females and males have sex and that's the way it is, and then certain type of bodies are produced. Because my science people have not found that to be so. Like, sex determination is this like huge gray area, like smorgasbord. And so for me, the archive in terms of the book as like a resting place right now is really, no, this is like the coolest, queerest, craziest time to be alive while science is being made and revisited and looked at. And there needs to be a book that says that all in one place. So I see a lot of my bodies of work right now. It's like, it's all kind of dropping into a book, even if I've learned everything about how I want to tell that story in other spaces. I don't know.
Yeah, the archive. I'm thinking, I have lots of thoughts popping around in my head right now. And one of the things that I thought through, like in the early 2000s, I came up with this term called deep les, which was about trying to use and think about radical, and I don't mean in radical feminist way, but like social, like a capacity to really change and shake up culture, ideas that were coming out of lesbian organizing in the 60s and 70s and the 80s that was being, I know, like the baby was being thrown out with the bathwater in terms of some of the really important ideas about creating new worlds, creating different ways of being together in the world, creating new sexualities. And so I wanted to use this idea of like pulling what was useful into a contemporary queer context, that we could use those tools rather than burning it all down or forgetting it all or reinventing the wheel every single time. We could stand on these histories instead of like feeling like we were just trying to figure it out alone. And so like there's the film I didn't get to show you, which is called Hers is Still a Dank Cave, where my partner Deirdre and I take two texts. One is Monique Wittig's text, The Straight Mind from 1980, where she talked about in that book how lesbians are not women because if you think about how they're socially constructed and defined outside of what the category of men and women are in a heterosexual, like straight mind. There's problems with that book, of course, but there's also this nugget of like really a very interesting idea about being able to step outside of the definitions of what we're expected to be. And we paired those ideas with Jose Munoz's more contemporary queer theory ideas about how we're not here yet. Queerness has not been, we haven't even gotten there yet. It's a shimmer on the horizon. And so the archive can be alive. And I think it's really important for queer people to know some of those histories and know a complicated view of those histories, because they will be erased, they will be gone, and they will be distorted. So being able to feel like you're not alone and isolated historically, and not just in this one moment where we cling together as queers, but we actually have this rich culture, is part of what the attempt is to do. And then like Killjoy's Castle becomes this like, it's like a teaching site. It actually is an archive where we're taking ads from old lesbian newsletters, which I'm sorry, lesbians invented the internet. Read it in Kate McKinney's book. Taking those ads and then making them into gravestones and then teaching them through like satire, but it is like a way of bringing that into a contemporary queer context.
Yeah, the queer archive, I think I see at play in both of these works, and I see and hear from both of you the way in which like you're kind of creating new archives in these relative like fields that previously exclude feminist conversations. But there's also like a deconstructing of like what an archive is supposed to do or what it's supposed to look like, what belongs in there, how we talk about those archives, and the work that we do to hide the vast queerness and transness of the world, or like the work that science and social sciences do to sort of act as if things aren't actually queer all the time, pretty much, like the deeper you look into it. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think about that a lot in terms of like sourcing and citation in science. So one way to erase studies that document same-sex sexual behavior in animals, or to like even I think scientists, like I was pointing out with the Pinyon-Jay study, don't even know what they aren't including. So like a lot of feminist biology has been going, like Marcy Lawton does in that example I gave, just simply looking at papers and being like, okay, cool. The narrative arc you painted tells one story, but I found this thing in your data that tells a really different story. And so I really have like learned a lot from, and a lot of Black feminists really looking at citation practices as a way to either erase or acknowledge like how knowledge bases get built. And just this exciting moment that we're in science, and using the book as a teaching moment of like, if we really go through the archive actually for a long time, like the first study on gay Adelie penguin behavior, I think was 1873. And looking and acknowledging the costs for scientists of publishing that work at that time, and that maybe today we can be more explicit about it.
Thank you so much for everyone for coming. Let's give one last round of applause.
Thank
for these
you.
amazing artists. Thank you.
Cheers.